Hello Year 8 and welcome to your first lesson on Britain 1750 to 1900. If you can write down the title, the aim and today's date please. And once you've done that, if you can look at the starter task. Now, the starter task asks you to think back to the Middle Ages and the Tudor period and briefly summarise how Britain had changed during those two periods. So if you could write two quick lists referring to your past work or your previous books of the main changes in these periods, you will probably now need to pause this video while you complete that task. So from that starter activity, hopefully you've outlined some of the key changes, such as the change in the power of the king. We saw a decrease in power of the king from William of Normandy right through to King John and the Magna Carta. We saw Henry VIII give away some of his power, and then Charles I lose his head. Hopefully you've also pointed out things like significant religious change, particularly with Henry VIII and the Tudor Reformation, the change to the Church of England. Hopefully as well you've included things like Mary Tudor bringing England back to being a Catholic country, and Elizabeth returning it to a Protestant country. Now, the important thing to point out here is that one of the biggest things we notice about this period, 1750 to 1900, is the rapid rate of change. More happens in this short period, or relatively short period, than the previous 750 years, and arguably Britain completely transformed. This rapid and significant change is what we call a revolution. This is ultimately the period of the Industrial Revolution and the modern world being born in Britain. So the first task you'll need to do is start summarising some of the big picture changes. So for this you'll need to open the document, which is imaginatively called 3 maps. There's a small version of it on the PowerPoint in front of you. This shows 3 maps of Britain spanning the period. What you need to quickly do now is, in roughly 6 sentences, can you summarise how Britain has changed throughout this period? What is the difference between the 3 maps? You can do it map by map, or you could take it theme by theme. The choice is yours, but as always you'll probably need to now pause this video to complete this task. Now, just to review that task, hopefully you are able to answer some of these questions that are in front of you. So particularly things like, what aspect of Britain has changed the most? Hopefully be identifying things like a huge increase in the amount of mines, factories, but also cities with large populations. One thing we can suggest about the population is that it is massively grown throughout this period. And again, if you look for the third question, is there a geographical pattern to these changes? You see a significant amount of change right throughout the north and west and Wales. And if you look at the southeast, the areas around London, these are largely unchanged, which would suggest a lot of this massive change throughout the period is geographically northern and western, and certainly, hopefully, you've spotted Manchester is right at the heart of this. Now, typically, when you talk to people about this period, it's often referred to as the period of the Industrial Revolution. And while this was a massive part of the period, this was only one small part of the many changes that happened throughout that period. There are actually 4 main revolutions that happen in Britain, and these have knock-on effects in lots of other areas. So we're going to look at Industrial Revolution, Agricultural Revolution, Urban Revolution and the Transport Revolution. So what you will need to do, if you can now write the 4 key terms in your margin or on one side of the piece of paper, on the following slide you will be given definitions, but these are matched up. Pause this video briefly while you write down the key terms. as you can see now, you have on the left hand side of the screen the 4 key terms that we've asked you to write down, and on the other side of the screen there are 4 mixed definitions. These are not correct, these need matching up, so you need to read each of the definitions in front of you, and then in your book or whatever you are working on, write the correct definition next to the key term. Pause this video while you complete that task. So now in front of you, you will see the correct terms for each, or the correct definitions for each of the key terms. Hopefully you've spotted obvious patterns, so particularly the word agricultural relates to farming, industrial relates to the manufacture of goods, urban means to do with growth of cities, and transport hopefully should be quite obvious. If you can just check you've got the correct answer and correct any that are wrong, tick any that are correct in green pen, and pause this video while you do this. Now, looking at the difference between 3 maps or the big picture changes throughout the country, throughout the periods, is fine, but it doesn't necessarily give us an idea of what this looked like to the people who were living through this. What did these changes actually mean and actually look like if you were living throughout this period? So to help you with this next task, you're going to need 2 documents. Now the first one is imaginatively called 3 pictures. When you open that, you will see 3 illustrations of the same village and surrounding area for the 3 different time periods. One for the 1750s, one for the 1830s, and one for the early 1900s. So first thing to do is look at these 3 illustrations together and start in your mind picking out the different changes that you can obviously see. Now the second document you're going to need is one called Overview of Changes. This is a chart that asks you to plot out some of the key changes and some of the key features to this particular village throughout the 3 key time periods. And it's asking you to look at certain themes like farming and agriculture, work and industry, urbanization and architecture, transport, and land use. Now the best way to do this would be to hone in on a particular theme at a time, and if you can possibly trace it from 1750 to 1825 to 1900, ideally join them up with arrows if you can, and fill in the columns that way. So for example, if we take a tricky one like urbanization and architecture, if we look in the 1750 image, you will see that a lot of the houses are quite small. They are usually 1 story and many of them have thatched roofs. So we put that into 1750. Then for the 1825 image, we'd say we start to see more brick buildings. More of them are more than 1 floor high. Thatched roofs are starting to diminish, and we're starting to see some more specialist buildings like mills. The church has had something extra built onto it. Some of the other buildings have become bigger, so we'd put that in 1825. And then by 1900 we see a massive change. We see rows of terrace houses. Almost all the land is now made up for houses and factories and buildings. It's clear from the illustrations that most of these buildings are made with uniform bricks and slate roofs instead of the old wooden frames and thatched housing, and the buildings have generally got a lot bigger and a lot closer together. So that would be how you fill in the chart. Try and pick out specific things. If you are feeling brave and want to do the extension task, land use can be quite a tricky thing to look at, but you'll obviously need to pause this video now for about 10-15 minutes and fill in as much detail on that chart as you can. So now on the screen in front of you is a blank version of the chart you have either been filling in as part of the Word document or have drawn in your book or on some other piece of paper. Can you now, if this is on paper, please take a photograph of this piece of work, or if it is done as a document, save it and upload your completed chart back to the Google Classroom so your class teacher can check the quality of your work and what you've done. And finally, to draw this all together, this is very much a your thought task, but I would also write these down in your book, please. If you can now just nicely summarise a few, maybe 3 or 4 sentences, what do you think the biggest change from the maps was reflected in the pictures? So can you identify a key thing that changed in the maps, but also changed in the picture? What was most obviously different throughout the period? Then could you possibly suggest, what do you think the biggest change for the people who lived through this would this have been? It's all well and good to say there was an increase in heavy industry and coal mining, but do you think that necessarily affected people who lived particularly in that village? Do you think that was what they noticed more? And finally, if you want to be even more specific, we've obviously got this picture of the kind of mid-1800s woman looking quite shocked. Can you suggest what you think might have been the biggest change throughout this period for this woman? Thank you very much for completing this task. Can you make sure you have definitely uploaded your completed version of the chart in one way or another to your Google Classroom? Until next week, goodbye.